Hello, I am Dr. Kerp, an associate professor at Ohio University and a fellow of our Contemporary History Institute. And I have been invited to do a short presentation on Poland in the current crisis in Ukraine. And the title of this presentation is In Search of Solidarity. And I briefly want to outline some of the ways in which this crisis is creating, is bringing to the fore a great number of tensions that exist for Poland in its connections and relations with Russia, Ukraine, and its Western allies. I'm going to focus particularly on Germany and the United States. First, very briefly in relation to Russia. Russian-Polish relations have a long, complicated, and tortured history that extend back to the 15th and 16th centuries. One of the striking things, of course, is many of the early conflicts between the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Tsarist Russia focused on strategic competition, the struggle for territory in Eastern Europe, particularly in Ukraine. So it is important to understand that this is not a new situation for Poles or for Russians for that matter, that they are competing for hearts, minds, and for territory in Ukraine. For much of that history, Poland sought to engage in its own version of imperial domination of Ukrainian spaces. And until the 20th century, Ukraine territories that we look at in the current borders of Ukraine contained significant Polish populations. Many, but not all of those Poles left Ukraine in the aftermath of the Second World War. But for our purposes, what I want to focus on is that by 1945, it had appeared as if Poland had definitively lost the struggle to control or even have influence in Ukrainian spaces. In the course of the last half of the 20th century, though, Russian domination of Ukraine collapsed. And after 1989, when the Soviet Union fell, many in Poland regarded the retreat of Russian power beyond Ukraine as a key element in Polish security. As long as Poland did not control Ukrainian spaces, that undermined potential Russian imperialism throughout the region, including Poland. The other thing to keep in mind, and this will be a theme I return to at other points in this brief presentation, is that in the course of the past 30 years, even relatively early on in the mid to late 1990s, Polish commentators, observers of East European affairs, especially of Russia, had gone from an initial hope that Polish-Russian relations could be put on a stronger, better footing than ever before, to a realization that Russian great power imperialism was reasserting itself. And this is in the 90s and the early 21st century when Poles had realized that. One sign of this was as early as 2004, 2005, when there were discussions to deploy a U.S. missile shield in Europe using Polish and Czech territory that was primarily meant to deter Iran. It wasn't meant to create a completely a complete missile protection against Russia. The Russian government under Vladimir Putin actually threatened military responses to any deployment of a U.S. missile shield in Poland. So direct threats against Poland have been part of Russian politics from almost the beginning of the 21st century, and Poles perceive Russian imperialism vis-a-vis Ukraine as representing a direct threat to Poland, since it will further ensconce Russian power on Poland's borders. With Ukraine, the situation is also quite complicated. Ukrainians, of course, remember that they were often objects of Polish imperialism. The people to people relations between Poles and Ukrainians have changed, though, in the course of the last 30 years. Prior to 1989, one of the more horrific memories many Poles had was the Volhynian Rzeź, the Volhynian massacres, when Ukrainians, struggling to assert what they regarded as Ukrainian interests, but also working in collaboration with Nazi Germany as allies to achieve. The Ukrainians were trying to achieve Ukrainian goals, but they were willing to work with the Nazis to do it, engaged in a massive campaign of ethnic cleansing against the Polish population living in Western Ukraine. And ethnic cleansing often entailed mass murder of local Polish populations. Many of the vast majority of Poles simply fled Ukraine and brought with them stories of Ukrainian terrorization. Now, of course, Poles also fought ferociously and committed their own crimes in Ukraine. But what people remembered were the awful things Ukrainians had done to Poles. And the Polish communist government, for its own reasons, played these up. That has started to change, particularly in the past 20 years. Many Ukrainians have come to Poland to find work, many of them legally. While Poland has a partially earned reputation as opposing, actually well earned in terms of opposing the reception of immigrants from the Middle East to Poland, the untold story of Polish politics at this time is that there are hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who are living and working in Poland, many of them legally, hundreds of thousands illegally, but the Polish government is very willing to turn a blind eye to that. And these people to people relationships have borne fruit. Poles are much more accepting of Ukraine at a popular level, as part of reflecting the official mind of many Polish strategic analysts that Poland needs a free Ukraine. So that is another thing that has changed in the course of the last 30 years, a movement to not only have strategic thinkers and politicians and soldiers, analysts recognizing Ukrainian independence is necessary for Polish security, but also having many Poles and Ukrainians getting to know each other, working with each other, and beginning to establish social ties. The Ukrainian diaspora in Poland has been active trying to assert Ukrainian interest in that country, particularly over the last several years, while Russian backed separatists have been waging war in their country. Now, on to Poland's relationship with its Western partners. Just a couple of things briefly. The current Polish government is often regarded as quite conservative. I think that is an oversimplification, as my remarks about Ukrainian immigration in Poland would indicate. But still, there are ways in which Poland is not integrating well within the European Union currently. And that is creating tensions as Poland attempts to collaborate with its European partners, both within the European Union as well as NATO. Germany represents a key problem for Poland in this regard because the German government is pursuing a policy of de escalation in Ukraine. And from the Polish perspective, this is ignoring open and flagrant Russian aggression, and not just in the current crisis, but in previous crises as well, where Germans, on the whole, have tried to find more collaborative solutions in the face of Vladimir Putin's um, various depredations in Ukraine and other countries that are even in the EU, such as the Baltic states, where Russians have been playing a destructive role for the past 20 years, where the Russian state sometimes using its own Russian populations in those states. And so part of what makes the Western response so complicated is that Germany has its own agendas vis-a-vis Russia, And sometimes these clash with the self proclaimed norms of NATO and security, as well as broader cultural economic cooperation with other Central Eastern European countries. Germans themselves don't entirely know what their policy should be, and this is very much a cause of dismay in Poland. And in that, the Germans are not alone, because US policy towards Russia has also been quite ambivalent. Russia has become something of a political football in this country, and particularly since the Obama administration, there have been various efforts by both parties in this country to reach out to Russia. The missile defense system, which I mentioned at the beginning in terms of Russian threats against Poland, had initially started as a Bush administration initiative. President Obama, when he first came into office, promised to continue that initiative, but then backed down from that. And actually, when the Obama administration made its announcement that there would be no missile shield in Poland in September the 17th, 2009, was a particularly badly chosen day, because September 17th was the anniversary of Nazi and Soviet joint military operations against Poland. The Germans had been fighting in Poland um, since August of 39, but on the 17th, Soviet armies rolled into eastern Poland. So it was very bad symbolism. And on the whole, the United States, like our German partners and other major players in NATO, Western players in NATO, have not worked at all seamlessly in collaborating with the Polish government. And the interesting thing, of course, is while the current complaint is that the Law and Justice Party that dominates Polish politics is authoritarian, even under relatively progressive Polish governments or liberal Polish governments in the previous 20 years, Western American, German, and general EU collaboration with Poland regionally in dealing with Russia has not been effective. So, what I want to suggest is there are crises within the Western alliance that are wrong footing our efforts to unite and deal with the problems being created by Russia in the region. And one of these problems is that Poles and their concerns, and Poles are not just in representing their concerns, but are discussing broader regional concerns, since Poles have been have been sensitized to, are sensitive to the security concerns of regional partners, be it in the Baltic states, countries within NATO and the European Union, as well as countries or like Ukraine or also Georgia that had suffered a Soviet invasion or Russian invasion in 2008. So what I want to leave you with is the notion that there are multiple crises going on, not just the crisis of current Russian actions on the border, which flow from deeper Russian intervention that has been going on in Ukraine for over 20 years. But also, there are crises within the Western alliance, both of values and strategic aims and assessments, and, if you will, a crisis of leadership, an inability of important Western players to collaborate effectively with our Polish allies, regardless of the political complexion of Poland's government in any given moment. These are some things to consider as you're trying to assess the fact that currently the single largest contingent of US troops deployed in Europe are moving toward Poland, that Poland has been willing to take point on this crisis, but that Poles often feel themselves exposed in their efforts to call attention to the current situation in their region.